10 seconds.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Tom Byrne. I'm the president of the Korea Society located in New York City. It's my pleasure to welcome attendees from around the world to today's program. We're very glad you were able to join us for this timely analysis of the April 15th Korea legislative election. President Bill Clinton's strategist in a successful campaign in 1992 quipped when asked what would be the driving issue of that election, "It's the economy, stupid." Well, Korea's election and all upcoming elections will be about the pandemic. Korea's national election was the first globally to be conducted anywhere during the coronavirus pandemic. Koreans have a high degree of civic awareness, but they felt safe in going to the polls because of their high trust in the government and public agencies, trust gained from the government's innovative and effective control of the coronavirus outbreak, and done without having to resort to draconian measures. Today, in today's program, we're very lucky to have Stanford University's Professor Gi-Wook Shin, who is joined by the Society's own Senior Director, Dr. Stephen Noerper. I look forward to a rich discussion, and we look forward to your engagement. You can send one question to policy@koreasociety.org, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. Without further ado, Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you all for joining us. We're very grateful to have the 275 registrants and all of you listening via audio podcast, viewing later via YouTube. And a special warm thanks to Professor Gi-Wook Shin. Gi-Wook, it's wonderful to have you back here at the Korea Society and now online. And over the years, we've had a wonderful relationship with Stanford. We're grateful to the center and for people who have served there, past and present, like David Straub and Dan Snyder, and of course yourself. Interesting times on the peninsula, certainly with this historic election on April 15th. And we're wondering if you could break that down for us and give us a feel for some of the excitement and some of the progress that has made it historic.
Okay, thanks, Steve, and thanks, Tom, for hosting this event. I'm very pleased to be here, and I think it's about 3 years ago when they had the presidential election. I did the same thing with Korea Society, so I'm very happy to be back. Before making my remarks, let me show you some basic outcomes of the elections. I think many of you already know, but let me just go over very quickly. Okay, so here it shows a breakdown of seats at the assembly. As you know, the ruling party had a landsliding victory, capturing about 60% of the seats. Here 180, and then main opposition got 103, and then the rest are very small. And definitely it's a big victory for ruling party, probably more than we expected in the beginning. But here one thing I'd like you to pay attention, which I'll come back later, is the proportion of the vote they got. Here, the ruling party got about 50% from district voting for candidate, and opposition got about 41.5. So even though the number of seats, there's a huge difference in terms of actual voting rate, it's only 8.5%. For proportional representation votes, actually, the main opposition got slightly more votes than ruling party. I think this has a very important implication. The second one, this is a regional distribution of the voting. And you can see the eastern side predominantly captured by the opposition, and the left side, the western parts by ruling party. And even in the Seoul, this is a Seoul district, there is a really high, very clear division between ruling and opposition. And here, the ruling party gained about 57 more votes in this election compared to last one. And main opposition lost about almost 20 seats. But the main difference is the third one, People's Party by An Cheol-soo. They had 38 seats last time, but got only 3 this time, which means that there's more polarization between progressive and conservative in Korean politics. And this one, you can see how they are voting on the election days. Okay, so yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Gi-Wook.
Any question or?
Yeah, sure. So one, I mean, you're showing us clearly the numbers and clearly some very safety conscious measures put in place, really a model election that way. And the first of the COVID era, as our friend John Delury has pointed out in the New York Times today. Can you break it out in terms of how you feel it has implications by way of a mandate for Moon Jae-in and the Democratic Party, and what the political repercussions relative to the party balance are?
Sure. Okay. So I have a few more remarks. So why don't I finish
please.
my remarks and then maybe engage discussions. Okay. Okay. So here we can think about what do they mean. So obviously, it's a great news for Moon Jae-in government. In the democratic era since 1987, this was the most decisive victory, winning 60% of the seat. And apparently, voters chose stability over change. Tom mentioned that Clinton was saying it's the economy, right? But now it was pandemic in Korean election this time. And I think Koreans gave the Moon government a second chance. Their record in performance for last 3 years has not been all that satisfactory, but still, I think they were given a second chance to perform better. And politically, now Moon Jae-in can avoid early lame duck, a common phase for Korean president under the current single-term presidency. And he also has enough political capital to push for his main policy agenda, both domestic and foreign. But not all news are great, because it could be bad news for Korean democracy, presenting real challenges. As you mentioned earlier, COVID-19 eclipsed all other issues, depriving the chance to discuss policy and other issues, a very important function of the elections. And as you saw in the table and the diagram or graph, political polarization was exacerbated with the demise of a third party or weakening of smaller parties. And this time they introduced a new mixed proportional system, hoping to give more seats to smaller parties so that they can reduce political polarization, but then outcome worked just the opposite way. And finally, now Moon Jae-in government controls the 3 branches of the state, and with controlling now assembly, it's very unusual even in Korean history. Okay, then what we can expect. Let me briefly touch on that, and then we can start our conversation. So in my view, Moon Jae-in government is likely to push for its policy agenda, once again, both domestic and foreign policy, with more confidence. And much of his policy is ideologically driven, like income-driven growth, social welfare, inter-Korean relations as well. So I don't expect any major change, and rather they are likely to push more aggressively their policy agenda. I think here lies a challenge or even a danger for Korean democracy. Because in my view, they won not so much because they did very well in the first 3 years, but rather because the opposition was just doing so poorly. I think for many voters, it was a matter of who's less bad than who's the best. However, the ruling party or ruling elite may see these outcomes as a solid confirmation of the public approval and support for their policies, and therefore may become more arrogant and aggressive in pushing for its ideological and political agenda. This could be dangerous because checks and balance are substantially weakened. So regarding COVID-19 management, obviously South Korea did very well in terms of containing the virus, but the real challenge will begin now with the economy. So briefly on the opposition, they will continue to struggle for direction and leadership. In this election, they couldn't present any alternative vision for Korean people. They lacked effective leadership. So they failed in both overall strategy and the nomination of viable candidates. But as I showed you earlier, in terms of voting rate, the difference is much smaller than the difference in the seats, which is 8.5%. Okay, that suggests that still there is a base for conservative, and they really have to come up with a new vision and fresh leadership in order to stay strong in Korean politics. Okay, so let me stop here, and then I'm happy to take any question or any conversation.
Sure. So Professor Shin, thank you very much for that overview. And you've given us quite a bit already on the mandate for the Democratic Party. If you could say a few more words about how the third party or multiple party aspect played into it. There were 27, and they, as you showed from your chart, basically did not or get what they hoped to attain, or at least it backfired in certain ways that you explained to me as well in our preparatory notes. Did you want to say a little bit more about the party process? And then also there's been a good deal of attention paid to the win by former Prime Minister Lee, which sets up a likely candidacy for him for president in 2022, as well as the emergence of the North Korean candidates that have captured some attention internationally, meaning mainly Tae Young-ho's win, as well as defector Ji Sung-ho. And both of them now will be members of the National Assembly, the first North Korean-born members to join the ROK National Assembly.
Okay, now we have many issues at the table. So let me start with this new proportional system. It's very complicated, so it's not easy to explain in easy way. But I think the main intent was to give more, I think, chance for a smaller party. So therefore, if you capture seats in the district voting, then you're at disadvantage. Okay, therefore, this time both ruling and main opposition party, okay, they didn't. I mean, they created sort of a satellite party, which didn't really present any candidate in the district. I mean, that way they were able to capture a majority of the seats through proportional representation. And as I said in elsewhere, there's no there's no problem in legal way, but that's really undermining democratic spirit or democratic norms. And now people all complaining, and probably they might get rid of this new system maybe after this election. So that's one thing. And regarding Tae-Young-oh and Ji-Sung-ho, and I mean that's a very interesting development. And I think this time, in my account, let's see, about four security experts got elected to the assembly, and I'm hoping that there will be more serious discussion about foreign policy, including inter-Korean relationship. And I'm sure Mr. Tae, Mr. Ji, they will speak out more vocally about North Korean policy at the assembly. So that's sort of my expectation. And also your point about Lee Na-kyun, is that your question about Lee
Yes,
Na-kyun?
that one as well. Yeah.
So I think clearly he will be front runner for next president, but still about 2 years away from the election. And I think in Korean politics or in any politics, 2 years, it's a fairly actually a long time. And I'm not sure at this point whether he will be able to continue and then become candidate for ruling party. I think key question is who will be the choice by very strong, almost fanatic supporters of Moon Jae-in. I mean, they control the party. It's up to them. They have very strong, voice in the party, and I think this time many of Moon Jae-in's secretaries in Blue House, they got elected to the assembly as well. So I think it really depends on who will be chosen by these strong Moon Jae-in supporters.
Mm. You mentioned that the hard work really begins now. What do you think about the viability for the Moon administration to push through the fiscal easing that they'll need for regrowing the economy, as well as issues that had predated the COVID crisis, like minimum wage?
Right, that's why I was saying that real challenge will begin now. Even before this pandemic crisis, Korean economy was going through a very tough time. And as you know, Korea has a high proportion of small business. They are going through really difficult times. And now the election is over, and how to revive, or how to boost the economy is a big challenge. And the question is whether the Moon Jae-in government is going to change its course for the economy, or they may push even further with like a minimum wage or income-driven economy and so on. So once again, my worry is that they might interpret the election outcome as confidence vote on their policy, and then they may just push for more aggressively, even though its performance for 3 years has not been that great.
But doesn't the 180 seats give them the ability to fast track and to make the changes that they have as priorities now, especially riding the political enthusiasm?
Right. So that's why, I mean, if you look at 3 years ago, after this candlelight protest, Moon Jae-in was enjoying really high approval rating. I mean, like 70-80% in the early days, right? And then it's like keep declining, and especially people saying that failure of economic policy was the main reason for that. But now, I mean, that's the main question once again, how they are going to interpret election outcomes, okay, and whether they are going to push more aggressively toward their initial agenda, or they may reflect more reality and try to make adjustments to their main policy issues.
Many of our viewers are interested in the inter-Korean dynamic and the challenges of North Korea. How do you think this further enables Moon in terms of his approach to North Korea, or the potential receptivity or commentary? We've not heard anything yet from Pyongyang in terms of their readout of the elections.
Okay, this also is a very important issue, not only for Korea, but also for the US-Korea alliance. Okay. As you know, the first year, there's nothing happening between two Koreas. The second year, right, there's with the Inter-Korean Summit and other rapprochements, and there was a lot of things going on between two Koreas, but for last year, not much happening. And Moon Jae-in and his groups, they know that they have only 2 years left. And in my own view, they're likely to get jump start and try to pursue very aggressive policy engagement toward North Korea. I have talked to some people in the ruling elite previous months and years, and one thing that came to me quite clear is that many of them also either served under Roh Moo-hyun government or very close to them, and I think many of them believe that Roh Moo-hyun failed because he compromised with conservative and other forces. So therefore, they are much less willing to compromise, and I think they are more likely to push further with their policy agenda. Okay, therefore, I wouldn't be surprised if they take very aggressive policy engagement toward North Korea. Okay, but then what about the relationship with the United States? As you know, it's an election year here, and I don't expect much going on between US and DPRK, at least this year. And can the Moon Jae-in government wait for a year? I don't think so, because then they will be into the last year. So this year will be very critical for them to do whatever efforts they can make toward North Korea or other issues. So once again, in my view, they're likely to push towards policy engagement toward North Korea, and it might create some friction between US and South Korea. I mean, already we have some issues regarding burden sharing and other sticky issues. And this is one area that I'm quite concerned because once again, US may not move much toward North Korea, and Moon Jae-in may feel that they are losing time. They gotta do something this year before being too late. And frankly speaking, I think some people in the South Korean ruling elite, they believe that their policy of engagement was really constrained by US policy. And they may argue among themselves, do we just have to wait until US give us permission, or they may just do now with this strong support from the people. Now they have only 2 years left in their office, and so that's one area that I'm frankly quite concerned in the coming month and year.
And you contend that this may be different because prior presidents have been then at this point regarded as so-called lame duck, but that may
Right.
not be the case then for Moon Jae-in going forward in his remaining 2 years.
Right. So, in the past, by this time, typically Korean presidents getting into a lame duck. But now, in a sense, he has, fresh 2 years, right? With a very strong vote from people. And, I think, they will really pursue very aggressively their reform agenda, both domestic and foreign policy.
Professor Shin, thank you for that. Let's turn now to Jonathan Corrado, who has been collecting the questions put forward at policy@koreasociety.org. Jonathan, could you share some of those questions for Professor Shin?
Sure, thanks. Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you, Professor Shin. We've got a lot of interest from our viewers all over the world. I'll start first with a question from Jungmin No, who comes from Radio Free Asia, journalist in Washington, D.C. Jungmin wants to know, how did the North Korea issue affect the election? North Korea's missile launches doesn't seem to have played a very large role. So we discussed a little bit about how the results of the election will affect South Korea's policy towards North Korea. But this question asks a little bit of the reverse. How did issues and challenges from North Korea impact the election?
I think short answer is not much. North Korea kept shooting some missiles, but it wasn't getting huge attention in Korea, and I don't think that was a big issue at all in this election. Once again, pandemic was main issue, and then maybe economic situation may have affected some way. But as I show you in the map, there's a clear division between Yeongnam and Honam area. Actually, last election, the ruling party captured more seats in the eastern parts of Korea, but they lost. On the other hand, they basically captured most of seats on the western side, right? So regional issue probably became more prominent, but it's largely pandemic crisis management. And this time, North Korea was not much factor in the election.
Great, thank you. Jungmin also wants to know a little bit more about the defectors' victories. Tae Young-ho and Ji Sung-ho, you already talked about that a little bit, but any further comments to elaborate the significance of that, what it means, what kind of action legislatively we're likely to see from them? Probably
the Conservative Party wanted to send a strong message by nominating Tae Young-ho, okay? And then I'm sure North Korea is very unhappy, right? That now, for them, Tae Young-ho is a traitor, right? Now became member of the parliament in most affluent area of South Korea. I think for maybe opposition party, it's a very clear message that this is a very important issue for us. Maybe a clear message to the ruling party about North Korean policy issue as well. So I think it was a very strategic move by the opposition party. But frankly, I'm not sure whether it has any positive impact overall, for the opposition party in the election.
Okay, thank you. Next, we're going to turn to Haewon Kim. Haewon Kim comes from us from Denton's. Haewon asks, what do you think the main reasons were for the defeat of the opposition party? You've discussed that a little bit, but this follow-on question perhaps provides an opportunity for further discussion. What could they do to consolidate or rebuild their presence in Korean politics? So how can the opposition rebuild?
Well, I'm not a political consultant, so, but I think we know that you have to get worse to get better, right? and probably they have some illusion that they can still do okay by just attacking the government. And in this election, that's why I said they lost in both strategy and tactics. They lost, war, but also, battles. And there wasn't any clear vision for Korean society and politics. They failed to make election as a lively place to discuss some policy agenda. And probably, and also they were not able to nominate, viable candidates for their district. I mean, that's why the difference in overall rating is only like 8.5%. But in terms of seats, they got only like what, 2/3 of the ruling party. So that shows that they failed in both strategy and tactic, right? And I think they really have to regroup. They really need a new leadership. They lost actually some prominent politicians like Oh Se-hun, Hwang Kyo-an, and Na Kyung-won, and so on. And it looks like maybe Hong Jun-pyo and Kim Tae-ho may come back to the party, but still, they represent more, older leadership, and how they can, I don't know, present new face, new leadership, and how to present a clear vision for Korean people. Without that, they're gonna continue to lose.
Professor Shin, and if I could pause at that point and interject 2 points. One is that there were 2 more women elected to the National Assembly, so at least striving toward some greater sense of gender balance, even though 19 is not as large a number as many would argue would be healthy. But also the emergence of the youth factor in the vote, the fact that the voting age lowered to 18. Do you see these, in lieu of the last question, as providing a different political landscape or different aspects of a mandate?
I think that's an excellent point, because conservative parties, they get more support from the senior people, right? And then some people saying that as Korea becoming aging, right? The population is aging. They might have some advantage, but actually it works the other way. Now, young people in Korea, they are voting, and this conservative party, they just don't appeal to a younger generation of Korean society. So that, once again, how to create a new vision, a new agenda, how to appeal to a younger generation. That's a big question for conservative. Otherwise, once again, there's not much hope.
Jonathan?
Okay, we're going to turn to our next question, which is also about alliance management, something that we've been talking about before. This question comes to us from Terrence Rohrig at the U.S. Naval War College. Terrence would like to know how this election result is likely to impact the ongoing burden sharing talks with the U.S.
That's also a very good question, and I think one possibility, they may wait, until November, and now it's quite possible that we might have a new regime in Washington, and I'm sure they will continue to negotiate. But then I don't think they will be easily pushed out. And now probably with the strong support in the election, they may feel more confident. They may negotiate more aggressively. And if it doesn't work out, they may say, let's just wait until November, then see what happens. That's quite possible.
Okay, great. Our next question, another topic that we sort of addressed earlier, but perhaps there's a chance to expand a little bit. So this comes to us from Professor Soo-young Chung from the Division of International Studies at Korea University. And Professor Chung is an alumni of Stanford University. So Professor Chung would like to know, to what extent did the COVID-19 outbreak affect the outcome of the Korean election? And do you think that the results of this Korean election will have implications for elections in other countries, including the upcoming presidential election in the United States?
And that's a very good and very interesting question. Okay, now I'd like to go maybe a step a little back, then look at South Korean management of this pandemic crisis. Obviously, okay, they have done very well in containing the virus. And some people are saying that that's a victory of maybe Korean democracy. But in my own view, that more reflects a legacy of Korean developmental state. Okay, and I know that the Korean government engaged sort of in a PR campaign through election that we are much better than other places, and in a sense they are lucky that the timing was perfect in Korea. And we know that Korea has a very effective centralized state system, so therefore it can be fairly effective in dealing with this kind of crisis. And also the government now, they remember very well what happened to Sewol, tragic incident years ago during Park Geun-hye government. So they put all the resources to contain this virus. But one thing that we have to remember is that that happens at the sacrifice of a lot of citizens, especially sacrificing their privacy. Okay, and for example, like early days in Korea, if you are found positive, right? I mean, basically, your information, personal information, became public pretty much, right? So that Koreans were willing to sacrifice their privacy and other stuff. And can it do that in the United States? Yeah, I mean, you know better than I do, but I don't think we can do the same thing in the States. Maybe not even in Japan or European countries. Okay, so certainly, I think what South Korea has done can have some implication for the other countries. But at the same time, we have a different institutional arrangements. We have a different culture. So something that we can learn, but I don't think we can replicate the same thing what South Korea has done in this country or elsewhere.
Okay, thanks. So your last response mentioned Japan. So this next question is about Korea-Japan relations. It comes to us from Klara Wojciechowska from the United Nations Department of Peace and Peacebuilding Affairs. She would like to know how this election outcome is going to impact Korea-Japan relations.
I don't think it is in the interest of Moon Jae-in government to make things worse. Okay, unless their popularity becomes really bad, really, and then they might provoke some anti-Japan sentiments again. But I think right now probably they may just want to maintain the status quo. I don't believe that they are trying to improve, aggressively their relationship with Japan. If you look at the ruling elite, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of their policy and politics are really driven ideologically, and I don't think they are trying to really improve their relationship with Japan during their tenure. They may not aggravate any further, but they may just try to maintain just like this. So I don't expect any huge improvements in the bilateral relationship between South Korea and Japan.
Okay, thank you. Next, we've got two questions that are about the regional aspect of the election. So it might be good to get that map ready with all the constituencies out there because that might help. So the first one is from Ed Baker from the Harvard Korea Institute. Ed asks, what do you expect the effect of the strong Gyeongsang-Cheolla regional split will be? What effect do you expect the election and the split will have on the selection of presidential candidates? So the Gyeongsang-Cheolla regional split, what's the larger significance of that, and could it affect later presidential politics?
Yeah, that's a little also tricky question. As I mentioned earlier, now we see more clear division between these two areas. The last time the ruling party, I think, had about like maybe 10 or so in a seats from Gyeongsang area, and even opposition had like 2 seats. But now it's a very clear division, and which is not good for Korean politics. At the same time, if you look at Seoul, Gyeonggi area, Seoul, Gyeonggi, Incheon area, it's less, that division is less visible. I mean, there's a Gangnam, Gangbok division in Seoul. But I think, eventually, the Seoul, Gyeonggi, Incheon area, I mean, they, occupy about half of the population. So how they, vote will be, very important. So having said that, going back to Lee Na-gyeon, he's from Honam area, and it's very hard for Honam, maybe candidates to be elected because the Honam side is much smaller than Yeongnam area, right? So that's why Kim Dae-jung had to make coalition with Kim Jong-pil, and both Roh Moo-hyun and Moon Jae-in came from Gyeongsang area. So if Lee Na-gyeon can win the election, he will be really, I don't know, maybe the first real candidate from Honam area, and they may have some political significance in Korean history. But once again, I think it's too early to say who will be nominated from each side, let alone predicting who will win the election.
Okay, so to follow up on that, another question, this one very particular about Daegu and the election results in Daegu. So Charlie Kimball from the Korea Center for International Finance asks, what about the results in the most heavily affected virus area, Daegu? Was it different from the national vote, etc.?
Okay, so if you look at Daegu, this time ruling party lost all the seats, all the district in Daegu. Basically, the opposition captured every seat in Daegu, Gyeongbuk area. I mean, so the so-called this TK is the main base for Korean conservative, and I'm sure those in Daegu, Gyeongbuk area, they are very unhappy with the government, and then I think some people calling like Daegu as like Korea's Wuhan, and there's certain bad feelings or even resentment among people in Daegu area. So once again, it doesn't bode very well for Korean democracy, because now in Daegu, Gyeongbuk area, is everybody supported opposition, whereas like in Honam area, they went all for ruling party. So it's a clear division, and I'm hoping that with the strong support from people, the Moon Jae-in government can try to facilitate more reconciliation between people from Yeongnam and Honam area. And I think he has a great chance to really promote regional reconciliation. Now, once again, he spent only 3 years, and he's not getting into lame duck. He has very strong political capital, political support. Okay, this is one agenda I think he can pursue, and he can remember, including history, as the one who really facilitated regional reconciliation in Korean history. I really hope that he can do that.
Okay, so another question now about the satellite parties, how the majority and the opposition party both use satellite parties, from Kenneth Nickel, who wants to know a little bit about the strategy involved here. Why did the two major parties create, foster the establishment of a parallel party for each that appeared only on the proportional representation part of the ballot? So maybe it would be good to just get a basic explanation for how this proportional representation works and how it differs from the other 253 seats, is it? Just how that basically works.
Okay, so it's a little complicated to explain, but let me try my best. Okay, so Korea has sort of a kind of parallel voting system. Okay, so they elect 253 people from single district voting system. Okay, so that's one list. At the same time, they are voting for the party, not for candidate. Okay, so they are electing the rest, so 47 from the party list. Okay, now in this new modified or reformed system, if your party elects through district votes, then you have some I think discount or some disadvantage. Okay, so I think out of 47, 30 seats are given to basically party who didn't elect their candidate through district system. Okay, so therefore, if your party has more seats through the district election, then you are a big disadvantage. Okay, that's why the main opposition party created a satellite party, which didn't present any candidate for district. At the same time, so the parent party, they didn't have any candidate for proportional representation. And the ruling party initially criticized that that's really bad, but then now they joined in creating its own satellite party. So, I mean, frankly, it's almost a joke. I mean, it's really, it's really bad for Korea, who's been really promoting democracy over the last 30 years. And now they are really getting into this kind of nonsense satellite party system. And once again, as I mentioned earlier, they might say legally nothing wrong, but then it's really undermining democratic spirit and norms in Korea. So I think this may be gone actually after this one.
Okay, one last question here from our viewing audience. This one comes from Sean King at Park Strategies, and he wants to know what type of policy with North Korea is the Moon administration now going to push for? Just how much rapprochement do you think is possible?
I mean, they understand the importance of cooperation with the international community, and then they don't want to maybe break this international sanction system. But still, they feel that they can do some inter-Korean project, especially in economic cooperation. For example, like restarting maybe Kaesong industrial complex, or reviving tourism, either Kumgang Mountain or elsewhere. So I think they feel that they should be able to pursue those inter-Korean economic cooperation without breaking the larger international sanction system. But once again, then they might contradict or conflict with U.S. policy. And the main question is how much patience they will have. Once again, they wanted to leave some legacy in inter-Korean cooperation. And some of them still feel that we are really constrained and checked by United States. We have only 2 years left. We can't really wait, especially now Trump is going through election and having tough time. So maybe it's time to do on our own way. Let's try and see what happens. So I think that's quite likely scenario in my view. And then once again, they might create some tension with the Trump administration.
Thank you, Professor Shin. You've given us a lot of nuance over the course of the hour, and clearly you've talked about the challenges ahead, the difficulty that will be continuing on the Korean political agenda, especially as they address both the public health issue and the very serious economic challenges ahead related to that, and as you indicated, some of the concerns that existed before the COVID crisis. And also the complexity in the process, the way we may see it evolve, the way we may see a fall off in some of the satellite parties and other issues. And as we lean forward to the 2022 election and the general mandate that President Moon Jae-in has. If we could step back just by way of a final question or observation that we might share. And there is an argument that the Korean government really has done a tremendous amount by way of the coronavirus response. And we've a lot up at the Korea Society webpage on that. And 150 plus nations have turned to Korea for test kits, for supplies, and for advice on how to effectively deal through early testing, through social distancing, through rapid use of technology to register responses, and through contact tracing. And so there's been a lot of applause, and we've seen a bump up in terms of Moon Jae-in's popularity, and that thus led to this momentum. So as you stand back as an observer, what does this say about the victory for liberal democracy, vice the developmental state or developmental democracy? And really, what does it say about the Korean voter? Because we've seen now through candlelight movement and now through this, with almost 30 million people turning out despite health concerns. I think that's a very positive story and a positive takeaway. So I'm wondering how you balance those realities.
Yes, it's certainly very positive to see very large, broad political participation, by voters going to election. Korean politics is never, boring, right? And then it's a good sign that still people care about election and they're going to vote. And this time, because of the pandemic situation, I think Korean government allowed 3 days actually for people to come to vote. Okay, so the main day of election, but also 2 days for sort of early voting as well. And I think once again, Korea has done very well in containing virus. In my view, that reflects very strong, effective developmental state. And then people are willing to sacrifice their privacy and other things for the public good. So I think that's what happened. But at the same time, I wanted to remind ourselves that it's not over. Okay, at least like for short term, Korean government did very well. But then it's still an ongoing issue. And then final record will be only, can be seen maybe after a year or so. So that's why how they can handle economic and other issues in the coming months. That's very, very important because let's say, if they are able to contain virus for short term, but if they fail to revive economy for mid to long term, then is it really successful or not? I mean, that's a question that we'll have to ask in the end. So So once again, I give credit to Korean government for what they have done for short term, but then it's not over. Then they really have to put a lot of efforts in really dealing with other larger issues for Korean society and politics.
Gi-Wook Shin, thank you very much for that. And thank you for your role as both director of the Shorenstein Center and as the Perry Professor for Korean Studies. We appreciate your joining us, and we're very grateful again to Stanford. Our chairwoman, Kathleen Stevens, has been a fellow at Stanford. Our former chairman, Ambassador Tom Hubbard, was a frequent visitor, and the connectivity with the Korea Society has been much appreciated over the years. So we'd like to extend a special thanks to your Shorenstein team as well, and for their facilitation and having you with us today. I'd like to thank Jonathan Corrado, as well as Peter Stemke, our Director of Technology, and the entire great team at the Korea Society, and to thank all of our viewers and listeners, especially at this challenging time. Invite you to see koreasociety.org for the listing of especially new features on COVID and Korea's response, as well as to join as a member. We'd love to have you on board. And Professor Gi-Wook Shin, we look forward to welcoming you back in the future. We know you're going to be with us in the fall for a program in-house, hopefully. And again, thank you all for joining us online, and see us at koreasociety.org.
Thank you.
Thank you.